All right, welcome to the first series live presentation with Evelyn Shimazu-Yi. Today, she's going to be presenting on Love Your Neighbor, the Quakers in the Fight for Justice. And welcome, Evelyn. Go ahead and get started.
Glad to be here. Before we start, I want to just put out a little disclaimer here. So if you'd all read over it before we start. Some of the items in this presentation may be disturbing to you. If you think that you will be disturbed or sensitive in hearing, seeing, reading accounts of violence, death, portrayals that have racial slurs or are stereotypic of any racial or ethnic group, please discontinue watching at this point. All items in this presentation are based on facts from oral interviews and reliable academic resources. This material is deemed appropriate for college audiences. Thank you. I'd like to welcome each one of you to Love Your Neighbor, Quakers in the Fight for Justice. This picture actually is a picture of the Friends headquarters, and I'm still researching to find out where it was located. So that's part of my job. The source that I received this from was written in Japanese. And since I don't read Japanese, I have to get a translator to find out exactly where this was located. I do see one familiar face right here, Lydia Kamek, and I knew that she was involved with people in the San Dimas area and in the Whittier area. And so I have a feeling it's pretty local. So this is a very interesting photo. It shows Japanese Americans who were part of the Quaker Church way back when. And they were quite active and very, very united with the non-Japanese Friends. The goals and objectives of this presentation is to educate and bridge a better understanding between, I can't see here, between peoples when sensitive topics of historic diversity come up, to invoke thoughts toward the peace of unifying faith that will surpass time in many different yet sincere spaces, and to assist in the healing of wounds surrounding diversity research and ministry. Topic of discussion, Japanese Americans, World War II, and Quakers. Becoming introduced to resources and some on campus who may want to continue the conversation and collaboration on a related research project individually or collectively through our university libraries assistants. Some of you may not be familiar with some of the terms, and so Jennifer suggested, and I thought it was a very good idea to have a glossary of definitions and also euphemisms that were used in this presentation. Quaker, AFS, American Friends Service, and Friends all refer to the Quakers. Concentration camp, a camp that is generally the type of camp where one is confined based on criteria generally by race or ethnicity and controlled by others, not of your race and its ethnicity. It is not a relocation camp. And many of the sources that were originally written about the concentration camps of the Japanese Americans, they referred to the camps as relocation camp. The relocation camp was called that, and it was a euphemism because it was not just relocation. It was a way for the government to make it sound as if it was not as bad as it was. Death camps versus concentration camps. There has been a lot of conversation in academia about the concentration camps in Nazi Germany, and that perhaps we should not use the word concentration camps. But actually, the discussion goes on further, and it talks about that death camps should most likely be the proper word for the Nazi concentration camps, as most people know them. There are basically 3 generations that were affected by the evacuation of the Japanese Americans during World War II into concentration camps. They were the Issei, the Nisei, and the Sansei. Issei were the first generation, Nisei was second generation, Sansei was third generation. And today we have Yonsei and Gosei generations. The Gosei would be my grandchildren's generation. And I am a Sansei, third generation. My parents were Nisei, second generation, born in the United States. And my grandparents were Issei, first generation. The terminology Nikkei notes that persons who may be a multiple generation American citizen by birth and have ancestors from Japan but may not know any history, generally does not have active ties to any allegiances there, and generally not living in Japan. An example would be persons born in the United States, many never having visited Japan. Nikkei can also be living in Brazil or any other country growing up and may not be able to speak Japanese or relate to the culture and have all or most of their life away from Japan. Okay, scripture. A reminder of the basics. This is from Matthew 22, 36 through 40. Teacher, and I put the word sensei, which is the word for teacher in Japanese, which is the greatest, sorry about that. Which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus replied, "Thou shalt love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second one is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." Again, Matthew 22, verses 36 through 40.
Are you a Quaker? And if not, why did you decide to speak on this topic?
No, I am not a Quaker. I am a Free Methodist. And these are the points of similarity I have observed in both the Free Methodism and Quakerism. A focus on holiness. They are supporters of equity and supporters of women contributing to ministry. And both groups greatly assisted Nikkei and the camps. Nikkei meaning Japanese Americans who were not born in Japan. I do not claim to be an expert on Quakers, nor a theologian, just a fellow academic sharing life experiences and what academic insights I have learned and resources I have researched in the area of faith, history, and diversity.
How do you feel about the topic and the word justice? You used it in your title.
I admit I was afraid to use the word justice, fearful of using it in the title of this presentation. I was fearing that others would start to label me as an undesirable radical academic. But I believe that God has now convinced me that justice was his invention, and that justice, was his invention, and that justice names him as the ultimate judge of what I do and who I am. And I believe that justice is a topic for all Christians, and we need to address this for ourselves introspectively.
How did Quakers start becoming God's hands and feet, and how were they light to the oppressed?
I'm starting out here with George Fox, who was more or less the founder of Quakerism. George Fox was a leader in the 17th century Christian awakening from which came the Quaker movement, now known as the Society of Friends or the Friends Church. And during civil strife between royalists and parliamentary forces, the movement spread rapidly across England and in American colonies in spite of harassment under the Commonwealth and Restoration governments that brought property loss, imprisonment, and sometimes death. This information was brought to you by George Fox University with their permission. And Quakers were pacifists. At one time, Fox was thrown down the church steps, beaten with sticks, and once with a brass-bound Bible. I will repeat that since we had some noise there and somebody's recording this so we can edit out some of the noise. Make sure that your computer is on mute. Quakers were and are pacifists. Fox was thrown down church steps, beaten with sticks, and once with a brass-bound Bible. He refused to be intimidated, and his courage and physical stamina gave credibility to the central theme of his preaching: the power through Christ to live a holy life. So he actually spent 6 months in Derby jail. And when he was offered release, if he would accept a commission in Cromwell's army, Fox refused, saying Christ has brought him to the covenant of peace, and for this he was jailed another 6 months. Okay, who are the Quakers? They're often called Children of Light, Publishers of Truth, and the Camp of the Lord. And this is their theme verse: "You are my friends if you do what I command." And that is where they got the name Friends.
Did Quakers help other oppressed minorities?
Yes, they reached out to African American slaves, Mexican immigrants, the Chinese, and Native Indians. They started institutions of higher education, especially women's colleges, such as Bryn Mawr College for women. Quakers also believed in equality and the value of each person as a creation of God. Northerners and abolitionists quickly deployed relief organizations such as the Friends Association of Philadelphia for the aid and elevation of free men. I'll let you read the rest yourself. And this is compliments and courtesy of Bryn Mawr College. Fox confronted the church for secondhand faith, sin excusing doctrine, hireling ministry. And I thought, what is hireling ministry? And I looked it up and it said, I think when you have a pastor, let's say, who's hired for a church, and basically he's working for the job and the salary, and that's his major focus, or his first focus, I should say, his first focus. But what Fox was contending was that most people should have their ministry and their mission first, and the salary should come as something that's secondary. Compromise with political powers. Belief that Christ revealed outwardly in history is light within each person, that women as well as men may minister, and that believers are called to personal holiness and to public righteousness. So he would call public servants to righteousness. And this is from Arthur O. Roberts.
How did Quakers and other Christians become light, hope, rest, and become the voice of the oppressed? And how did they stand in the gap?
Well, with the Japanese Americans, they had a wonderful relationship with the Quakers before the war, before World War II.
Japanese Issei first generation and Nisei second generation built a total of more than one church a year in the last century. Today, there are more than 100 Nikkei mission-spawned churches throughout the United States. The majority are located on the West Coast, many in California.
And I will ask this question. How did the peaceful Quakers assist in the evacuation of 110,000 Japanese American citizens and their families? And how were they different than other Americans and Christians of all races, even including Nisei and Sansei? And this answers the question further. Love was their mission, and the Quakers had a very special bond with the Japanese American Christian community. A good number of the Quakers spoke the Japanese language, and that's more than I can say for myself. I don't speak the Japanese language. I'm a third generation, Sansei, and most people beyond the second generation usually don't speak any Japanese at all. But the Quakers were an exception. They made an effort to learn somebody else's language. And Americans have this terrible reputation of expecting everyone to learn their language, English. but make no effort to learn others' languages. And I think this was a wonderful thing that the Quakers did.
And I believe this picture is from circa 1915. And I think that is Lydia Kamek again, right there in the front row, second from the right. Answer continued. Quakers were our neighbors to the Japanese American community in Whittier and Pasadena and in Norwalk before World War II. Things were going well, but then Pearl Harbor happened and everything changed.
Quakers, because they were involved before the war, were very humble and wanted to learn Japanese as well as teach English. They respected the culture to which they were guests and visitors, and they taught their faith and their consecrated lifestyle as missionaries to the Japanese nationals in Japan. When the war broke out, they played a very important role that no one else could have filled the gap between generations. When Nikkei were forced to evacuate at short notice, the Quakers bridged the generational gap and the language gap. Executive Order 9066. This was from our collection at APU. We do have a copy of this. Instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry living in our area and also in other areas. They had one for San Francisco area and all the other areas in California where there were Japanese towns where there were many Japanese living. Evacuation averaged 48 hours to 2 weeks notice. Can you imagine trying to pack up everything from your house in 48 hours or 2 weeks notice and be told that you're going somewhere where you had no idea where you were traveling? People wanted to see that the Japanese Americans were out of the state. There were many farmers who eagerly eyed the Japanese farms, mainly because of the fact that they were quite successful and had the market at that particular time. Breed helped to encourage inflammatory newspaper articles. Before the Japanese Americans were put in the camps, the assembly centers were put together. These were temporary housing. One of them was the Santa Anita racetrack. And at the Santa Anita racetrack, I took many oral histories from some of the people that were housed in that area. One of them was one of our Nisei honorary degree holders who was one of our alum. And he said that the latrines were overflowing with excrement. There was dysentery and unhealthy conditions, a lack of food, and especially for babies, a lack of education for children. When my mother told me it was just temporary, I thought maybe, oh, a few days or a few weeks, but it was actually months that they had to stay there. Large families had to be in small quarters that were the same size for one horse. The quarters smelled of horse manure and had red ants, and visitors came to share items through the fence, meaning Quakers and other churchgoers who were not Japanese American, who brought them food and clothing and other comforts from home. Anyone who was 1/16 Japanese ancestry, even orphans, were forcibly evacuated as suspect of being spies, and orphans were included. The picture on the right shows an aerial view of, I believe this might be Poston, Arizona, and all these little rectangular pieces are barracks, and it housed numerous families in each barrack. Each family was allotted a room about 20 feet by 20 feet. Conditions of traveling to the concentration camps. They had to have their shades drawn. Temperatures were very hot, up to about 116 degrees. Many elderly and infants suffered from extreme temperatures, from 30 below zero in the mountains of Wyoming, 214 degrees in the shade in Poston, Arizona. And here we see Quakers. There are Quakers here bringing food to the trains because there was no refrigeration and they didn't have any way to pack things, food and other things, not knowing how long that they were going to travel or where they were going. Here's a quote from someone who unexpectedly entered a small town. While I was waiting, I ordered lunch from a store in the area. The owner of the shop turned to his customers and said, "You shouldn't buy anything from the Japs yet. They will have to leave in a day or two, so they'll be forced to sell their stuff for cheap." And this is a picture of one of the Japanese Americans' fruits and vegetable stores. And they put a sign out to let everybody know that they were Americans. Quakers showed love when mainstream America showed hatred on radio, news, media, and billboards. When others tried to tell us we were not American and that we were foreigners, when we were Americans, the Quakers knew we were Americans and deserved better. But the Japanese Americans were either too young or too old to do anything about it. Issei were seniors, but denied citizenship. English was not their first language, but for some, came as young persons over 50 years before and now were successful businessmen, but they were made powerless to vote, powerless to own property. Nisei's second generation were on an average about 18 years old and not ready for this kind of move and not politically powerful. And we Sansei, like my generation, were toddlers and infants. So what could we do? This is an aerial view of the 3 Poston concentration camps, Poston 1, Poston 2, and Poston 3. And this is a map of all the different barracks. You can see the little rectangular pieces again. This is of one of the 3 camps. And restrooms were all located in a separate building. So if you have to get up in the middle of the night, go to the bathroom, you have to put your clothes on and go walk a distance in order to use the bathroom. This is the annual Pacific Coast Japanese Free Methodist Conference. It was held at Azusa Pacific University. You can see right here. Some of you might recognize the area. The building is different. This is the administration building. Back in 1947, this was after camp. Dr. Haggard right here in the picture with Dr. Burnett are there next to Frank Omi right here with nice dark black hair. Frank Omi is here in this picture right over here at the arsoning of one of the churches, which is my church. And it was rebuilt, and this is the new building that was rebuilt. And he is standing here with Reverend David Shigekawa, who is right here in this picture as a young man coming out of camp. But he is now here, an older gentleman. And this is my mother right here, my grandmother and grandfather. And this was taken by my grandfather's homemade camera. He actually ordered pieces of things from his friends and the Sears catalog and constructed a camera and got film paper and made his own pictures with this camera. And that's how we got this picture. Many of the photos that you see that were put out by the government were posed. People were dressed nice. They were sitting inside these rooms that looked like a regular home, had bookshelves with books on them. People were smoking pipes and playing chess. These were all orchestrated pictures. So you really can't go by the pictures that the government put out. This is a real picture right here. Oh, this is Reverend Kashitani and his wife and son who celebrated his 7th birthday at camp. And here's the tar paper building in the background.
Making the best of the situation, grandfather made a box camera and had someone take a picture. He made furniture out of branches found in the desert. And the government photos, many of them that you see, were posed or were taken at the very end of camp when the Japanese Americans had fixed up the camp to make it look nice. And this barrack picture was not a posed picture. This was one that was taken with my grandfather's camera that he constructed.
This is a comment from one of the internees. Women, if they've ever been raped, don't go around talking about it. You know, I was a victim of rape or anything like that. This is exactly the kind of feeling that we as evacuees, victims of circumstances, had at the time of the evacuation. A lot of Nisei and Issei are actually ashamed of the fact that they have had to own up to the fact that they were in a concentration camp. You just don't talk about having been a victim of rape. And I think this is where our mental block is. Therefore, it is very hard for the young people to go to their parents and ask them, have you had this experience? Amy Uno Ishii, Nisei, April 17th, 1973. An NBC reporter asked, how many people are buried here in Manzanar Cemetery? And this was asked of one internee. And his response was, a whole generation of Japanese, which he meant Japanese and Japanese Americans, who are also now so frightened that they will not talk. They're quiet Americans. They're all buried here. And this was reported by Sue Embry, Nisei, November 15th, 1973. Here's a film, but I don't know if it will show. We tried it earlier and it wouldn't work, so we're gonna try it again. If it doesn't work, we'll just skip on to the rest. Basically, the constitutional question or fact that 7 out of the 10 points in the Bill of Rights were violated in the case of Japanese Americans. This did not trouble many people. And this is from a statement from Maria Agnes Aya Madrid, an evacuee.
Feel that this hearing has been long overdue, for I equate the evacuation with rape. A rape victim finds it very difficult to talk about it and suffers from shock, and I think that we have been through that period where it has been difficult to talk about.
I've never been able to talk about this, but more people have come up to me and said I must speak up. My children, even my own children, don't know that my brother was shot in the back.
No one benefits when truth is silent. The bigots and uninformed demagogues and persecutors will become increasingly suppressive and abusive, attempting to diminish our characters through crude jokes and half-truths. I will be proud to be a Japanese, and I would want to be equally proud to be an American. I do hope my late father's ideals and expectations for this country will someday be realized. The redress we are seeking cannot return to us the years of unjustified imprisonment, emotional, mental, and physical hardships we endured, or any treasured possessions we were forced to sell or were stolen from us. Those in positions of power today who will be deciding the fate of this issue not only finalize it for us, but for every citizen, present and future, who could be subjected to collective punishment because of his race, creed, or national origin. final judgment will affect all Americans, now and for all time. Thank you.
We were the only Japanese-American family in Kodiak, Alaska. In a short time, my father and 2 uncles were arrested and put in concentration camps. I am very bitter about this. I have not seen my father since I was 11 years old. I am now 51 years old. I have missed my father very much, and I wonder I wonder if he's alive today. As for now, all I can do excuse me. As for now, all I can do is hope and pray. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr.
They talk about being let out of camp in 45, 44, 43. I don't think we ever did get out of camp. I think we're beginning to get out of camp now.
And now in closing, I wonder whether you'd permit me one personal reminiscence, one prompted by an old newspaper report sent to me by Rose Ochi, a former internee. The clipping comes from the Pacific Citizen and is dated December 1945. Arriving by plane from Washington, the article begins, General Joseph W. Stilwell pinned the Distinguished Service Cross on Mary Masuda in a simple ceremony on the porch of her small frame shack near Talbot, Orange County. She was one of the first Americans of Japanese ancestry to return from relocation centers to California's farmlands. Vinegar Joe Stilwell was there that day to honor Kazuo Masuda, Mary's brother. You see, while Mary and her parents were in an internment camp, Kazuo served as staff sergeant to the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. In one action, Kazuo ordered his men back and advanced through heavy fire, hauling a mortar. For 12 hours, he engaged in a single-handed barrage of Nazi positions. Several weeks later, at Cassino, Kazuo staged another lone advance. This time, it cost him his life.
Okay, another person who helped out quite a bit was Frank Aaron Smith. He actually wrote a letter to President Truman. And so he and Quakers often did this. He was a Free Methodist, but Quakers did the same thing. They wrote letters to the government. They wrote letters to the president, and they were quite effective. This Frank Aaron Smith was a Methodist, and he says that there were arsonists. Here, let me see if I could read it. Dear President Truman, this is a request to you to ask J. Edgar Hoover and his organization to take a hand in the control of the arsonists and night riders who are terrorizing a few Japanese Americans who have returned from the West Coast. So when Japanese Americans returned to the West Coast, they were terrorized by people. And this particular area, and in the area where there were farmers who wanted to keep the area free of Japanese American farmers, are the ones who were causing these problems. They were arsoning homes, they were graffitiing them, they were doing all kinds of things and getting away with it. So eventually what they did was they did finally send police and the FBI to come down. These were all the camps and the isolation centers. They call them isolation centers. Those were high security camps. Relocation center is not even called a camp, was a concentration camp. So anything where you see relocation center, WRA, that's what it was. And that's the use of euphemism that they used. Assembly center was the temporary holding concentration camp at Santa Anita and some of the other racetracks where people were kept inside of horse stalls. This is Herbert Nicholson at Manzanar. This picture was painted by a Japanese American woman, and she depicted Nicholson, who was a Quaker, driving to the different camps. And I think this particular one is painted at Manzanar. And he would come and he would bring clothing, other goods for the Japanese Americans there. He made numerous trips there and numerous trips to other camps. He also drove to Arizona, to post in Arizona, to the 3 camps there. Amazing man, man of God. His life consisted of early morning reading his Bible, sometimes for hours, and a very disciplined prayer life as well. I'll just flip through some of these pictures. These are camouflage nets that some of the women at Manzanar had to work on for the war effort. These were the high security camp people. They were put in this camp and they had to shovel coal. This was a cemetery, and they made their own monuments out of stones that they found in the area. Both of these had a date of 1942. And that was the first year they arrived. Many died because of young and old died. There are many other denominations that also helped. These are some of the people Inazo Nitobe, who was a Quaker. Helen Eli Brill, Quaker. Paul Nagano, Baptist. Maud Thornton, Free Methodist. Hatanaka, Quaker. Reverend Herbert and Mary Nicholson. Dr. Joseph Goodman. Reverend Arnold Nakajima. Esther Rhodes helped to make the hostel here in Los Angeles for people returning from camps that didn't have a place to live. Wonderful woman. Teruko Hashimoto, Dr. Cornelius Haggard visited the camps from APU, early institution, Pacific Bible College. Victor Fujiu was a Free Methodist and also one of our alum. He was a pastor. Reverend Stanley Jones, some of you in theology know who he was. He actually visited the camps also. George Takaya, one of our alum.
Floyd Schmo, who was the brother-in-law of Gordon Hirabayashi, fellow Quaker, and Reverend John Miyabe, longest-serving superintendent of the Pacific Coast Japanese Free Methodist Conference. Dr. Ralph Mayberry, Baptist, and Reverend Harry Hashimoto, Holiness. Christian churches, Free Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, Brethren, Congregationalists, and United Methodists assisted in many tangible ways, but most often people would almost say, especially the Quakers, made a big difference. They did. They persisted for years, showing genuine love above and beyond when America's mainstream showed us war, hysteria, hatred, and greed.
This is at the camp, not the concentration camp, but summer camp that was founded by these pastors. And they founded an organization, a mission organization called GEMS, J-E-M-S. And that was because when they went to other missionary societies, because they were Japanese descent, they would not accept them. So they decided, let's make our own. So they made their own. That organization is now the umbrella organization for over 100 different churches. This is a wooden Madonna that was given to our former president, Dr. Cornelius Haggard, as appreciation and thanks for coming and encouraging them in the camps. A Quaker effort here is 50,000 Christmas gifts for the children in the concentration camps. Wonderful people, Quakers. Okay, a lot of the laws that were passed to stop people from owning property and all these exclusionary acts were most of all overturned, but of course the victory came rather late for some of these people. As you can see up here, here's a college graduated family. They had a nice home, and when they left, they had to leave all this. Just wanted to show you that they were not recent immigrants. They were people who have been here for many, many years. This is getting toward the ends here, so I just want to show you just some pictures. Terminal Island, where they had 48 hours to exit. Here's the Quakers. Here's a Quaker woman holding a cold glass of water for one of the evacuees here. Gordon Hirabayashi, if you want to hear about his history, just get in touch with me and I'll be able to tell you about him. He was a Quaker. Wonderful man. Brave man. Floyd Schmo was his, you saw his picture earlier. The friends and brethren visited the camps every week, bringing chilled fruit and cold drinks to comfort the internees. Helen Brill and Joseph Goodman were teachers in the camps. have histories of Helen Eli Brill here, if any of you are interested in it. She was a wonderful Quaker. And Joseph Goodman also, who was a teacher. A lot of them helped to make this hostel when people returned from the camps. And Esther Rhodes, here she is. She was one of them who was responsible for that. And Arnold Nakajima, one of our former alum. Reparations and redress eventually did come, and Executive Order 9066 was expired by President Ford. Okay, I'm going to skip all the way to the end. And if any of you have any questions, further questions, you can ask me at this time.
Thank you, Evelyn. I was wondering if you could go back to that church image so that we can just get the church image, because that's a beautiful one.
All right, go back there.
Okay.
Okay.
So thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you for understanding of the technical issues that we were having. Again, you will get a link of that video after the presentation has concluded, as well as an archive recording, especially for those that were not able to attend live. And with that, I just wanted, before we get into questions, I wanted to highlight what C. Lambert has said earlier in the chat, that Quakers also helped to rescue the Jews from the Holocaust in Europe. She just wanted to highlight that. And at this time, if you wanted to ask any questions, go ahead and type it in the chat. I'll be moderating or monitoring that so Evelyn can get those questions answered. So go ahead and open it up.
I don't bite. Any questions? Comments?
One's coming through.
Oh, okay.
Question from Liz. Will you be sharing the slides with us as well?
If you need them, a lot of these, I really had to rush in putting this together. It was a lot of work. And so a lot of these I have to continue to put the embedded information on each photo. But if you would like to use some of these photos for educational purposes, I can get you the permissions for those.
Okay, so.
And also to comment on Carol's comment, Carol Lambert's comment, the Friends also received the Nobel Peace Prize for the work they did in Germany. I would have covered that here, but it's just so much to cover. Maybe that could be the next one that we do.
All right, a new question. How have these survivors overcome bitterness over how they were treated?
Not everyone did, but the one, Well, I'd say the two things that helped them the most was their cultural background and their faith. And those who didn't have those things, they were the ones that I think suffered the most. The ones who were too Americanized that they could not accept the fact that they were not accepted in the United States. That was the hardest part for them. And then the ones who were very Japanese in culture would say, shigata ganai, I think, shigata ganai, which means it can't be helped. And that is a phrase that is used a lot. And I heard it as a child. And when there was a situation where you could not deal with it and it was out of your hands and you were powerless, then you left it to the higher power. And that was a very Japanese thing, but it's very Christian-like in that you believe in a higher power somewhere. And I think those two things combined actually made them quite exceptionally resilient with the help of all these Quakers and Methodists and Free Methodists and Baptists and all these Congregationalists. I mean, you name it, every single denomination sent people, but not everyone from every denomination felt the same. My parents went into a church to get married, and the pastor took one look at the paperwork and showed that they were Japanese. And he told them to get out of his church and not come back. And so not everyone was hospitable, but it was the ones, the handful of people who were faithful and did what God wanted them to do. They were the ones that made the biggest difference. And that is why the Japanese Americans survived. I think if it was any other minority, I don't think this would have happened. I think it's because of the Christians and the missionaries, especially the Quakers, who spoke Japanese and who went to the camps and translated for them and wrote letters for them, did immeasurably what no one else could have done, really. So it's up to us. And it wasn't a lot. Just that one man, Nicholson, he was like an army. What he did was like an army.
All right. Can you share a little bit about the process of reparations? For example, who initiated the process?
The Japanese American people themselves did. Many of the Japanese Americans, in fact, when the war broke out, I think the Japanese Americans might have been the ones with the highest level of college education at the time in the country, or one of the highest. And they actually had a higher average of college graduates in their ranks than white America, actually, at that time. But I think their numbers have fallen since then. But the young Sansei who were like my generation, who were just starting college, and some of the Nisei who finally were able to become successful in business, were in the professional fields, doctors, lawyers, and so forth. And
Senator Inoue.
And, one of our first women senators also from Hawaii made a very big difference. And so they took things to court and they followed up on it. Now, the sad news is, and I will tell you this, anybody who's thinking about, oh, maybe we should try this for our group, it was quite a job. And time is an enemy. And it took them like 40 years just to get a trial. So you can imagine, with all that education and all those people and all the help, it took them 40 years to get anybody to even look at it. And so it's important to get people in government, important to get people to be your voice in different places. I mean, for those of you who are looking at things like that, these kinds of things need to be, I don't know, it's up to God. I really think God is the answer. I think the reason why they were successful was because there were so many Christians, a lot of people praying. we have over, like I said, we have over 100 churches, Japanese American started churches, mostly in California.
Next comment from Carmen. Evelyn, thank you for doing this presentation and research. I understand not all Quakers consider themselves Christians, but there seems that there is a lot we can learn from Quakers regarding social justice. Can you talk about the relationship between Quakers and the Japanese community today?
What has happened is that the Japanese Americans really were very autonomous. And what happened was the other churches who were not Quaker, the major denominations wanted, and this is still happening today, wanted this minority group to break up their ethnic churches and to join the white church, okay? They thought it would be good for the Japanese Americans. Unfortunately, this was, I mean, it was, they meant well, but that was not the answer. They really needed to have their own autonomy. After what they went through, they had to have control over their own churches. And so they made their own segregation. But they did commiserate with other white pastors and churches quite extensively, and still do. But they still maintain much of their separateness, and for good reason at the time. Now I think things are changing, and that is why I'm doing this kind of history, because I think the Japanese American church is going away, because Japanese American people are very different than the rest of the Asian community. They've experienced something quite different, and I think that they understand diversity more than many other groups. I'm not saying everybody does in the group, in that group, but they definitely are integrating their churches very extensively right now. And pretty soon there will not be a Japanese American church, with the exception of a Nichigo division, which speaks Japanese. And so I hope that answers your question.
All right, another question here. When I was doing research on Ruth Esther Smith, Friends missionary from California, I discovered that the California yearly meetings of Friends was very local, in opposition to the alien laws in the 20s. Did you do any research on that part of the Quaker involvement?
The part of my involvement was just with the Japanese Americans. That is actually enough for me. I'm not a theologian. And the only reason I got into this was because of the, God just brought me into looking at the history of the Japanese Americans. So I went to the theology library, our wonderful theology library, and I sat there and I read through about, let's see, how many years? 1942 to 1947, was that 5 years? I sat there for hours. And I read through the yearly minutes that we have in our library. And quite interesting, quite interesting. Like I said, not everyone was on board in every denomination, in every church, in any denomination or any religion. There were Catholics there too, Catholics, and there were Buddhists who were helping. But this group of Quakers, the ones that I mentioned to you, and I am not familiar with the one who you spoke of, but perhaps we can get together sometime, and I'd like to talk to you about that, because I'd like to hear more about that. But all the churches were not in agreement. And even within the Friends themselves, I had read of some dissension to what Nicholson was doing. People were very patriotic during that time. And some of them thought that what he was doing was, anti-American or something. But God knew better. It wasn't anti-American. It was pro-American. It was pro-American citizens who were of Japanese ancestry. That's what it was. But people didn't see it that way. They only looked at our faces.
Do you see parallels between the treatment of Japanese Americans during World War II and today's Dreamers or other groups in 2022?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I do. it's because what happens is that a people, an entire group of people, are labeled, you know, and disregarded and disrespected as individuals, as human beings. And when I saw the newscasts about children being kept in these borderline camps and things like that, and hearing about people who came to the United States not wanting to break the law because they were children or infants. You know, it's not their fault that they were here. And to have somebody who's grown up here, spent all their lives here, and in essence are really American in their heart, and told to go back to their country when it really isn't their country. And that is what happened to some of the Japanese Americans. They were put in these camps. And if you answered a question wrong on the questionnaire, then you would get sent to a high security camp. That was the one you saw with people with the coal, digging coal. And they were treated dastardly. They were treated terribly. And there was even a story about someone who was, they wanted him to confess that he was a spy. And so they were hitting him in the head with a baseball bat. These are all factual events. And so these are the kinds of things that went on. And one family whose father was taken away in the middle of the night in his night clothes ended up in North Dakota, which is on the recording that I couldn't show to you today, in the snow with his slippers. He was still wearing the same clothes that he was wearing when they picked him up in California and took him to North Dakota. So total disregard for human rights. And so this kind of thing went on. It was silent and quiet, and nobody spoke about it. That one woman, I do have her story, and I have it recorded. And what happened to her was she said that her father was gone for 2 years. They never knew where he went. When they came to the house and seized property and all kinds of things and just took him away, they gave no indication where he was going. They heard nothing from him for 2 years, except for the fact that they did get a couple of letters, but the letters were censored. Pieces were cut out with scissors, cut out of the letters, so they could not receive the entire message that he was trying to send. And he was moved numerous times because each time where it was coming from was from a different place. So it's a very, very sad episode in United States history, but a very victorious one for Christians and the Christian church.
Side note, today is International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Just highlighting that. And then this will be our last question.
Yes.
At APU today, what symbol might appropriately teach current and future students to learn the lessons so this never happens again? For example, something like the Armenian Genocide Memorial Tribute that is outside of the multimedia classrooms on East Campus.
I think programs, we should really follow up with special programs and involve the community. We really need to involve communities because there are communities out there who don't feel represented here at APU. And I think we need to have them, participate. And I think by doing that, you're going to get more students. I mean, that's sort of a side note and a kind of a perk. But, like Fox said, first of all, it's your ministry. It's your ministry. You're not a hireling. You're not just taking it for the money and taking your job for the money. You're doing it because you have a mission to accomplish. And you do your mission. And if you do your mission, then things will happen. If you actively get involved with things, something will happen. That's what I truly believe that.
And a little added comment, and Evelyn, you can add to it, of course. We do have a Japanese American collection on East Campus in Marshburn Library. Evelyn, do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I didn't plan to, but I'll just say that we do have a collection. Most of this collection happened by accident. When we had our honorary degree program for our Nisei Americans who didn't graduate in 2010, we had a ceremony for them to give them their degrees that they didn't get almost 70 years prior. By getting involved in that, I did their biographies, and following the biographies and interviews, they came to me and said, "Here, can you keep this for me?" And there were incredible things that they gave me. They said, I wasn't going to give this to anyone, and they had kept it for over 70 years, some of this material, and had not given it to anyone because they didn't trust anyone with it. So all of a sudden, I was receiving all of these things that people had kept, these ministers had kept, our alum had kept for almost 70 years. And so that's part of the collection. Some of them are worship service, programs from inside the camps, funeral pictures, all kinds of stuff, letters from sick relatives, sending letters to people in the camp, people that got left behind in the hospital and then died without their families, things like that. Very interesting things. I'm hoping that our library and our university, and I'm going to put a plug in here right now for this, it has been my hope, and that's one of the reasons I haven't retired, is because my dream is to see another collection like this for Korean Americans and Chinese Americans and Latino Americans and Middle Eastern Americans, African Americans, Native Americans, all kinds of Americans. That's what I'd like to see.
Thank you, Evelyn. Ken Waters would like to, I'm going to end with this quote by Martin Luther King Jr. God is able to conquer the evils of history. So I think that is a very fitting quote to end with. And I wanted to thank Evelyn to bringing this great history lesson and great presentation. Thank you again, those of you that were able to join us live and those that are listening via archive. Thank you for taking the time to listen as well. And just a last reminder that I will be sending the link to that video that was not able to work during the presentation. And thank you once again. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and all of you are released to go. And thank you once again. And I hope you do join us for our next presentation on research and faith. And that will be presented by Dr. Dave Harmeyer. And on February 17th, you will see announcements throughout the university, upcoming in the Provost newsletter that will be announced there as well. And it will be posted on the library calendar. So if you go to apu.edu/library, under news and calendar, you will see our calendar for future events. And we hope to see you at future live discussions. So thank you once again. Thank you, Evelyn, once again.
Thank you, Jennifer.
See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.